One, rolling.
Hi guys, welcome to the third installment of Let's Talk by Paper Crane Society. We are your hosts, Kriti
and Purvi. Today we're here with a special guest, Ritambra Mehta from Nazariya.
I'm Ritambara. I work with a queer feminist resource group that's based out of Delhi called, I've already said the name, it's called Nazariya Queer Feminist Resource Group. We work on gender sexuality issues with a focus on queer women and trans persons.
Thank you so much for being here. It's so exciting to have you. Starting with the questions. How can the experience of being and presenting openly LGBTQIA+ impact a person?
That's one of the few ways, and there are multiple and plenty of ways people get discriminated against, and gender identity, sexual behavior, sexual orientation is one of the ways people are also discriminated against. And to sort of get into the details of how this discrimination happens, for instance, just start at the school level. So when you're 5 or 6, when you're just entering school, there are these particular norms that the school play by, the kind of uniforms people are going to wear. In fact, the classroom that I grew up in, I studied in a convent school, only girls studied there, but I often spoke to my friends who studied in co-ed schools. There was this, of course, uniform was one issue, like boys had to wear a certain uniform, girls had to wear a certain kind of uniform, where these girls and boys are going to sit, the way we are supposed to behave in a classroom, where we are supposed to behave in a playground. And the moment you deviate from the norm, the moment you deviate from what it means to be a 7-year-old boy or what it means to be a 7-year-old girl, the moment you deviate from that norm, the discrimination starts happening.
Right.
Because there are certain institutions, and school is just one example, that is segregated in a gendered way. So only the realities of boys and girls are accepted and nobody else. So the moment you feel that you do not express yourselves well in the uniform that you're wearing, or the uniform that you've been told to wear, for example. So here's a person who you think is a woman but identifies as a boy. They don't feel comfortable in wearing a skirt and a shirt. The journey or the distress that a person would go through is something that's even beyond discrimination, so to speak. So these are little emotional distressors that a gender non-conforming person or a trans person would go through the moment you start going to school. And when it comes to sexual orientation, of course, the kind of textbooks that one goes through, the kind of examples that are given in a classroom, and just forget a formal classroom setting, the kind of conversations the friends would have outside of a classroom around crushes, around girlfriends, around boyfriends, are also quite gendered. As in, if I am somebody, I'm a woman, and I like a person of the same sex, same gender, it's very difficult for me to identify with these conversations as well. For example, even in smaller age groups, when we are learning about what a family looks like, there's a very particular notion of what a family looks like, right? There'll be a father, there'll be a mother, and there'll be kids. But what about what about people who like people of the same gender, right?
Right.
Then is the textbook communicating that that's not possible at all? That you don't fit the norm, or forget gender identity and sexual orientation. There could be people in my classroom who have single parents, for instance. Do we imagine a family outside of the man, woman, children norm? Can it be of two fathers? Can it consist of two mothers, or can it consist of a single parent?
Would it be a better option to have unisex uniforms, or would it be a better option to sort of start propagating the idea that clothes do not have a gender and people should be able to wear what they can within what the school dress codes offer?
Right. Akshita, that's a question worth thinking about. Of course, I don't have a clear-cut response in terms of, if not a uniform, then what, right? Because see, the reason, again, I'm not an expert on this subject, but the reason why uniforms were started, the idea was to create some sort of a uniformity, right? Because a school would consist of students from all walks of life. There'll be a difference in caste, class, religion. Of course, gender is one that's really visible, right? Perhaps that's the reason why uniforms were started, to give a sense of uniformity. But when we talk about unisex uniforms, then the question also arises, what is unisex for us? So if I were to ask you that question, what according to you is a unisex uniform?
Well, according to me, that would also quite depend on from which perspective I was saying. Because if I was speaking from the perspective of a school, then that would just simply be a shirt and a pant. But in my perspective, there's nothing really that's completely unisex.
Absolutely. This is exactly what we need to think about, because for us, a unisex uniform is a pant and a shirt, for instance. But a pant and a shirt is also extremely gendered, right? And to say that let's do away with these values that we attach to uniform is also not, is this quite simplistic, right? That let me not attach any gendered value to these uniforms to begin with. So the idea should also be, again, not to sort of get into what uniforms should we be wearing, but for example, schools as an institution also need to think about the fact that there are people who may not, there are girls who may not identify as girls, there are boys who may not identify as boys, there are people who would like to switch, there are people who would like to wear pant and shirt, there are people who would like to wear a skirt. So the idea is to also give that sense of freedom while retaining a sense of uniformity, right?
Right.
So, again, there is no one simple answer, but the idea would be to continuously question that is this whole solution of providing uniformity also addressing issues of how people attribute a certain gender to the kind of uniform a person is wearing. For example, if you're wearing a skirt, you are a girl. If you're wearing a pant, you are a boy. Boys need to wear pants. Girls need to wear skirt. So we need to get over or question these binaries, these concepts to begin with.
Ritambra, you shared several examples of stereotypes in our society. So I would like to ask you, how do you think, what are some specific steps we collectively as a society can take to overcome these harmful generational stereotypes created about LGBTQIA+ members?
In fact, to engage in conversations like these, right? How many of us really invest our resources and energy into engaging with people who are not like us, who are not from the same community, who are not from the same diaspora, who are not from the same class, who are not from the same gender. So if I were to sort of, again, this is something that I'll urge the three of you to do as well. So if I were to, and it's not it won't take a lot of time, but if I were to sort of ask you, who are your most trusted people in your life, apart from your parents, your siblings, or your relatives? So if you think of these three people, just try and also then think of the class location that they're coming from, the region that they're coming from, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, the language that they speak, the kind of educational qualifications that they have, right? And
Right.
a lot of us, so when I do this exercise, I often realize that my circle is limited to the kind of class that I come from. It's limited to the gender identity that I identify with. It's limited to so I am friends with people. So I identify as queer, and my friends are also my trusted circle of friends also happen to be from the queer community. They are from the same region. Most of these friends I made in educational spaces during my bachelor's, during my master's. So how much energy do we spend on expanding our circles? And this is and also there's nothing wrong in it. By default, we are wired to affiliate with people who look like us, who talk like us, who walk like us, who are like us, who think like us, right? So there's nothing wrong with it, but it also leads to a lot of erroneous beliefs about people that I'm not even interacted with, and this particularly happens with the people of a non-normative, so to speak, gender identity and sexual orientation. If when I think about it, my engagement with spaces like these only started, say, about 10 years back, 15 years back. But while growing up, for me, trans people only meant hijras, for example. And there was no way for somebody growing up in the 90s without internet to also find out what do we mean by trans identities. For me, sexual orientation only meant being lesbian or gay. And for me, it only meant highly sexualized identities, because this is what or something dirty, because this is what my parents communicated to me. So how does one come out of it, or how does one grow out of these again erroneous beliefs that your parents keep telling you about? So the idea is to question each and every aspect, and the idea is to also try and in smaller ways to expand your social circle, to join a group, or to read more, or to watch diversified content on on Netflix or Amazon, or whatever form of entertainment that we access online.
Thank you really much for your insight about that. So my next question to you would be is, what should be our goal as allies to the LGBTQ community regarding the protection of queer people going into the next 10 years? So you talked about how your experience has been in the previous 10 years. So what do you think going on into the next decade? What should it look like? What should it be? What should our goals be? What should our aims be? What outlook do we take towards this?
So one thing that and this is something Nazariya also constantly talks about, that when we consider ourselves allies, of course we consider ourselves allies when we are looking at the issue of queerness, or when we look at LGBT as an identity, but sort of take a back seat and think about how society generally tends to discriminate against people who are not normal, so to speak, right? So my normal in Delhi is very different from your normal in Nasik. It's very different from Purbi's normal in Indianapolis, right? So society generally tends to discriminate, and the idea is to think of issues that LGBT people face, and also realizing that the same people are also against. So okay, let me put it this way. As young people, society is against a lot of things that one ends up doing. Society is against premarital sex. Society is against communicating fair knowledge on sexual health and reproductive rights. Society is against giving comprehensive sexuality education to young people. Society is against marrying out of your own caste. Society is against marrying out of your own religion. Society is against marrying out of your own race. So, for example, society is against a lot of things. And the idea is to not park LGBT issues in a corner and say, okay, these are LGBT issues. These are issues of people with disabilities. These are issues of women, so to speak, and these are issues of X, Y, and Z community. The idea is also to sort of take a back seat and realize that our fight is not against people who bully trans young people who identify as trans. Our fight is not just against people who are homophobic, but our fight is against elements, or our fight is against these norms that tell us that A is bad and B is good, or X is good, Y is bad. So as allies, we also need to think about our realities and how one day my reality is normal and tomorrow that reality might not be normal. So as allies, we also need to keep looking at a larger picture and not just think of ourselves as separate from the kind of struggles LGBT people go through. So the idea is also to learn from their lives. For example, tomorrow, at 22, 23, when you're being pressured to get married, and if you don't want to get married, you want to be an independent person, or you want to wait till you reach a certain age to get married. The idea is to also then link your struggles as a young woman who has taken a step or has made the choice to not get married, to relate your struggle to that LGBT person as well. Because the LGBT person is also going through the same social stigma that you are also going through as a 20-year-old. So the idea is to also think about these social structures rather than focus on, for example, just gender, just sexuality, just caste, just class. So the idea is to think of these things as social structures. Today they impact somebody else, tomorrow they will impact me. And as allies, today as allies of LGBT people, this is something that we should be building our knowledge about. What are these social structures that discriminate against LGBT people? So, yeah.
I think you made some great gave us some great examples that put these issues into perspective. My next question is, what do you think it takes to create a revolution and massive change in mindset other than representation?
I also identify myself, I of course I identify myself as a queer person, but I also identify myself as a feminist. So whenever I think of something, these two, if I see them as lenses, so I will always try and look at something from a queer feminist lens. So when I often think of LGBT issues, I often think that we have not even resolved the issue of gender, that binary notion of gender when it comes to men and women. And when the world has not come to terms with a woman being out in the open, how do I even expect the world to come to terms with the fact that this person is a lesbian woman, for instance, right? So while one needs to talk about these specific identities as well, that identity of a lesbian woman and how is it different from the identity of a gay man, and how is it different from identity of a bisexual woman, or how how the identity is different, the kind of issues and struggles a trans person would go through, or the kind of euphoria a trans person would go through. So the idea is that how this revolution or the social change or whatever you want to call it would come when we when we when we acknowledge these unique realities, but also try and think of what we were talking about earlier, right? When we also try and think of social structures, when we also try and think of why lesbian women are so invisible, why bisexual women are so invisible, why trans persons are looked at a certain way. So this is what a social change is all about. Instead of saying that we need more lesbian women in media, we also need to question what works in the media and what does not work in the media. What sort of lesbian representation would work in the media and would not work in the media. That of course these identities are important and we are here to talk about these identities, but let us try and look at social hierarchies and social structures outside of those identities.
I wanted more of a perspective on gatekeeping and homophobia within the LGBT plus community. So, for example, I've seen a lot of times like a lot of people will accept gay people or lesbian people, but not bisexuality, or bisexuality would be considered transphobic, and they would say pansexuality is not a real sexuality, or asexuality is not within the LGBT community. And so there's a lot of conflict within this community. So could you give us more of an insight on that?
That's another thing, no? When you focus so much on identities, when you attach material benefits to these identities, it will there will be some sort of gatekeeping. So for instance, so gatekeeping can be in two ways. One is to, this is not a legitimate gender identity, or this is not a legitimate sexual orientation. Of course, that's one thing. The other sort of gatekeeping is also when we tend to think there is only one way to be a lesbian, or there's only one way to be a bisexual person, or there's only one way to be trans. Now, this is something one often hears, that you are not lesbian enough, or you're not trans enough, or you're not bisexual enough. And what does it really mean to be saying all of these things? And homophobia within the LGBT community, I think more like not to sort of not to pit homophobia and transphobia together, but there is a lot of transphobia within the LGBT community. You go on these dating sites, and also see, now to think about it, LGBT people are also not, it's not that LGBT people do not discriminate. So going back to that first question, so one faces a lot of discrimination from people outside the community, but one faces a lot of discrimination within the community. So LGBT people are also extremely classist. LGBT people are also extremely casteist. LGBT people are also extremely transphobic, for example. LGBT people are also they are also very ableist. So for example, when you go on these dating sites, I'm not sure if you're a fat person, for example, your success rate on these dating websites, same-sex dating websites, is also going to be terrible. Or for example, if you're trans and if you go on a dating website, I'm not sure what sort of a response. In fact, I'm not sure you'll get a very positive response. So this is something, and because now the thing that we believe at Nazariya is, because we end up focusing so much on identities, and we end up focusing so much on creating these little cliques and communities, that we often tend to forget that what is it that we are fighting against. Are we fighting against each other, or are we fighting against that larger structure that oppresses a certain kind of people, that oppresses people with disabilities, that oppresses fat people, that oppresses Black people, or that oppresses people of a certain class, caste, religion. So again, I don't know if it answers your question, but of course there is gatekeeping, and there is a reason why this sort of a gatekeeping also happens.
You, Rituparna Bora, and Purnima Gupta are the founding members of this foundation. So can you tell us a little bit about what you envisioned while creating Nazariya? And maybe you can include a story of how the three of you met and conceptualized this organization.
Oh, so Ritu and I met as a part of Delhi Queer Pride Organizing Committee, and then both of us went on to work with a collective called Kashti. It was a LBT collective, a collective for lesbian, bisexual, and trans persons identified assigned female at birth. And then Purnima and Ritu worked together in an organization. And the idea was that all of us identified as feminists as well. And the idea was to actually do what I've been talking about, right? That we are often tend to look at LGBTQs as etc. So issues of women, issues of children, issues of people with disabilities, and issues of LGBT people. But gender and sexuality also cuts across a lot of these identities. Women can be bisexual, women can be lesbian, or children can identify as trans, or their sexual orientation might be different from what the world perceives to be. People with disabilities can be of varying gender identities and sexual orientations, and the idea was to exactly talk about these things, that being LGBT is not an etc, but we are part of these various communities. We are part of, like, our issues cut across issues of anyone and everyone. And this is the reason why we started also, all of us, since people who started it worked in the development sector, we often realized that education is not just about learning. For example, it's not just about creating teaching learning materials, it's not just about getting more girls to school, it's not about enrollment ratios, it's not just about marks, it's not just about a lot of things that we associate education with, but education is also about issues of gender and sexuality. Have you ever thought about these are some things that were going on in our mind, that have you ever thought about why girls stop going to school after a particular point, and in spite of state governments in India providing them with bicycles, still the enrollment rate amongst high school girls is really low? Because of course there are issues of sexuality at play, where the parents don't want girls to go to school after a certain age because they think that they are unsafe. They cite issues of not having enough toilets in the school for not sending their girls to school. Then the other sort of underlying aspects behind young people not scoring well, or young people not interested in education, could also be because at the age of 13 you're going through so much. There are changes in your body, you tend to see a lot of things around you. How do you make sense of the world around you, right? How will I be able to concentrate on a chapter on say nuclear reactor or something else, when there is some other kind of reaction going on in my head? How do I make sense of it all? Do I have somebody to talk to? Is my teacher going to listen to me? Is my sibling going to listen to me? Are my parents going to listen to me? And the idea was that, of course, learning is important, but at the same time, talking about these aspects is also important. When organizations talk about providing equitable healthcare resources, or equitable access to healthcare, then one often things purely in terms of gender or class, but it's also about, are my health facilities sensitive towards trans people? Are my health facilities sensitive um, towards lesbian women? Are my health facilities geared to provide some relief to gay men, for example? So these are the kind of questions that were going on in our head, and this is what motivated us to start Nazariya.
That's a really interesting origin story. Could you talk us through your victory in the Shivani Bhatt versus National Capital Territory of Delhi and other cases?
So now, at that point, Shivani, they preferred uh, they preferred the name Shivi, and I think we are not in touch anymore. But now he goes by the name Naveen. So that case was we had just started off. It happened in 2015, and we had no idea how to go about it. But so this person got in touch. In fact, this person didn't get in touch. Their partner got in touch with us, and their partner was back in USA. They got in touch with an organization, and that organization in Bangalore got in touch with us. Then we were communicating with Naveen over a period of few weeks. We asked them to provide us with some legal documents, and as we were about to rescue them, so to speak, because they were in a violent and an abusive household, um, and we were able to do it, but we also realized that the family was a little influential and then got in touch with police. But everything said and done, the judgment that we got towards the end was, so for somebody like me who wasn't, say, a part of your Nas, um, that Nas victory in 2009 and all of those things. For me, it was so powerful to see how reality of a trans person was translated um, into a success story in a courtroom where the judge spoke about how perhaps there is a need to emancipate yourself from your parents, or perhaps there is a need to recognize that this person does not identify with the gender that was assigned to him at birth. The parents are responsible for recognizing it. The parents are responsible for letting this person continue with their education in US. And these are the things that make you hopeful that even though society somewhere, of course, discriminates, but law also to a certain extent, not always, but law also to a certain extent also sort of upholds our constitutional rights. And not just in case of Naveen, we've also been part of numerous cases where two women want to live together, and we've approached courts, and they've guaranteed that there is nothing under the law that can stop two women from living together. For example, in case if you're over the age of 18, your parents don't really have a say over your life, and the constitution would respect your autonomy, for instance. So these are aspects that one feels, that makes hopeful that at the end of the day, of course, one hears a lot of things about how the legal system works, but at the end of the day, we've definitely experienced some positive outcomes when we've gone to the courts, where judges have taken out time and have been sensitive to listen to what the petitioners want to say. They pay heed to what they're thinking. They pay heed to their emotional turmoil, and these are aspects that one sort of pushes the organization, or pushes the people who are part of that organization to work further.
Wow, that's
That
so inspiring.
So I wish Naveen and all the people that you have helped all the happiness in the future. It's really inspiring, as Purvi said, to hear about all of these stories, and I really hope that you are able to help more people like Naveen in the future to gain the rights that they deserve.
Mm.
So Nazariya, having created Ishq, Dosti and All That, a bilingual short film that two co-founders of Nazariya QFRG were involved in, could you please share a little bit about other media and pop culture that show an accurate depiction of the LGBTQ plus community? And yeah, I would also appreciate if you could share a little bit about the conceptualization of the film.
That's a tough one because even when we sit in office and talk about pop culture and social media and all of those things, this is something that we often talk about, that what does it mean, like what does representation mean, what does it mean to see a queer women on screen, for example. And it often ends with us saying that, like, having multiple representations, for example, is always the way to go. So often we have these in films and in TV shows, we often have this tokenistic queer character. But we seldom have a character whose queerness is just a part of their lives, right?
Yeah.
Where the character is not seen as a queer person, but it's a character who happens to be queer. But at the same
Right.
time, we are also at a point where last 2 3 years have been quite amazing when it comes to um, pop culture, media, entertainment, where we've had plenty of queer characters, and one would want that sort of a representation to continue. But the way to go would be to represent lives of queer people as it is, and not sort of pander to a certain community. And the idea behind making Ish Dosti and all that was exactly that. We didn't want a film that educates people on lives of queer persons. We didn't want to show this is how a queer person lives, this is something that you can learn from. But the idea was just to capture their life at a particular point, to talk about dating, to talk about heartbreak, to talk about sex, to talk about sexuality and all of those things. And this is how one would want that representation to be, to just get a glimpse into um, an aspect of their life. And this is what one also expects from social media, that we don't want these tokenistic characters, but I just want a character who happens to be a certain someone without getting into too many details. And that's what I don't think there's something as like one true representation. But yes, I don't know, like for me, it would be the right way to go about
Mhm.
representing my life.
Yeah, I agree too. A lot of movies and TV shows just have like these outlandish, outrageous representations of members of the LGBTQ plus community that doesn't necessarily align with their real lives. And I really like the idea behind creating Ishq Dosti and all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to mention on the terms of pop culture. I recently read a book, all thanks to Kriti. She actually suggested this book to me, called Red, White, and Royal Blue. which I'm a huge fan
Oh my
of
God,
now.
stop. That's such a good book.
I love that book. It is so good.
It's
Red,
my
White, and
favorite
Royal
book
Blue.
too.
I can't. What?
It's Red, White, and Royal Blue.
It's a red, white, and royal blue. Okay.
Yeah, I think books definitely do a better job than like TV shows and movies in representing um, the
Right,
LGBTQ plus community.
right.
Should have a look at this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I had another question.
Hmm.
So, in 2017, Nazariya QFRG, with a Delhi-based sexual and reproductive health and rights NGO, Tarshi, on a series of bilingual workshops on stress management and burnout prevention for LGBTQIA plus individuals. Could you please share some of the simple stress management techniques covered in those workshops?
Well, the idea behind organizing those workshops was very not simple. A lot of thought went into it, and the idea was that a lot of people working with the community also happen to be from the community, and because of which there are certain unique stressors that people go through. Um, and what as two organizations who work on gender sexuality can can do to facilitate a space that only talks about their unique stressors and not about anything else. So that was the idea, and the other idea was that we didn't want to get into so there is a lot of focus on self-care where people talk about meditation, people talk about exercise, people talk about yoga, people talk about a lot of these things that cost a lot of money, and for instance meditation, yoga, exercise may not work for a lot of people, um, because see, that's another thing, no, you also need to understand why would somebody suggest yoga, because it's located in a certain cultural context, right? Why yoga is gaining a lot of popularity, or why meditation is gaining a lot of popularity. So the idea was to also move away from these often cited and extremely quote unquote popular ways of um, caring for yourself. So at these workshops, one of the things that we did was for people to create a space where people can vent, where people can talk about, can bash the community, can bash their families, can express themselves. Um, and one often realizes that there are very few spaces available where one can be themselves and one can talk without censoring themselves. So that was one idea. So in terms of techniques, of course, there were certain techniques that were shared. Um, there is something called Jinshin Jitsu. There's something called emotional freedom technique. But the larger idea was not to really share these techniques, but to come to a space where there is communal catharsis. So we did things like, in fact, all of us, and these were adult people who've been working in spaces of violence against women for the last 25-30 years. But all we did was to draw and color, for instance. So for us to experience as adults also, to get into that space where we are doing nothing but listening to music and drawing something and coloring it. To do simple activities like playing with the balloon, for instance, or to dance, or to create music out of these simple instruments was something that led to a certain kind of catharsis. So of course, there are these lots of techniques, there are lots of spaces available that will urge you to do this, that, and the other. But just the fact that one created an exclusive space to talk about these things is what I think worked with these workshops.
That's So neat. I wanted to get your opinion on how long do you think it will take for the LGBTQ plus community to become fully incorporated and accepted in the Indian society?
That's a I really don't know how to respond, because see, what do we mean by fully incorporated? So when the laws change, when courts allow people to get married, when courts allow people to adopt kids, when insurance companies start catering to same-sex couples. So what does it mean to be fully incorporated? It can mean all of these things, right?
Mhm.
And at the same time, there's also a possibility that all of these things can happen, but still LGBT people are not incorporated. And I think one can think about it from the point of view of, say, for example, that binary men, women, that how women have pretty much all the rights, right, in every country. For instance, majority of countries, women have um, they have the right to vote, they have the right to study, they have a right to get higher education, and so on and so forth. But do I still think women are fully integrated or incorporated in our society? No. There is still a lot of sexism. In fact, forget absolute discrimination. All of us do not discriminate against women, but at the same time, there are certain aspects to our culture that are inherently discriminatory, right? The kind of
Mhm.
career choices that women are able to make, the kind of educational choices women are able to make. Do they have the full freedom or the full choice to um, be a part of public spaces? So one is never sure what it means to be fully incorporated into something. Is it just about legal aspects, or is it about this? But perhaps it is about a combination of all of these things in in total. But again, like going back to what I was sharing earlier, like this full incorporation also needs to be thought through. That like one needs to work at every level and not just focus on, say, the legal aspects or the social aspects. Yeah.
That was a very interesting conversation. Thank you again, Ritambara. You guys at home can support us in Nazariya through the links in the description below. Please share, comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.